Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. There's a lot of different topics I want to cover. I'll let David introduce himself. Thank you for joining me, David.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is David Patrick Carey. I am a PhD candidate at the Graduate Theological Union, focusing on new religious movements, most specifically the use of technologies for transcendence, of which includes psychedelic substances, drugs, as well as machine technologies, computers, the singularity, and ways in which matter is perceived to allow people to transcend matter.
Okay. For everybody out there who doesn't know, the GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, is in Berkeley, California, right?
Right. Yep. It's in Berkeley, California. And then I run a YouTube channel online called Church of the Eternal Logos, which really is more of a ministry in which I use Orthodox theology, or what's often called Logos theology, to look at aspects of the world, culture, news events, society, theology, and then just create sort of thematic streams to talk about. And then I have another YouTube channel called Religious Studies 101 that I hope to develop further. That's really the remnants of a former YouTube channel that used to promote and advocate for the use of psychedelic substances and New Age spirituality.
Okay. And I found your work through Father Deacon Ananias Sorum.
Oh,
so
okay.
you're on his website, Patristic Faith, as well.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, I'm part of the Patristic Faith team.
That's a great group. So far I've interviewed Father Deacon Ananias and Father Turbo Qualls.
Oh, okay.
And I've really enjoyed my discussion with all of them. So it's really great. And just to introduce people to my interest in some of these topics, I am familiar. So when I read your bio and saw that you had gone to the GTU, that is just like a rock's throw away from where I went, which is Cal Berkeley. I wear my hat today. So I used to go use the library up there occasionally. So I was always kind of confused about that school. So there is a Jesuit school there, but then there's also kind of like an ecumenical college. Correct me if I'm wrong. So
yeah, so the Graduate Theological Union is made up of member schools. Okay. So there's multiple different schools that make up the Graduate Theological Union. The Graduate Theological Union is the only one that offers a PhD, an academic PhD in religion. So religious studies is very, very small at Cal Berkeley, and they don't offer any graduate degrees. So if you're going to pursue a graduate degree in the New Age or Christianity or ancient religions, you would do that over at the Graduate Theological Union. And then you can use the various member schools that other people, they offer undergraduate and then master's degrees, usually, like the Dominican school, which really focuses on Aristotelian philosophy, the Jesuit school, which maybe has more of a sociological or social aspect. There is a Buddhist school. There's a Dharma school for Hinduism. There's an Islamic school. There's multiple different Christian schools. And so they all then offer classes and have their own professors that are paid through those member schools, but then they're part of the Graduate Theological Union. So if you're a student, a master's student or PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union, you can then take any of those classes and work with any of those professors.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. At the time I went up and used the library, I was working on Russian iconography in my art history classes, and there was a few interesting books there in French, but I didn't find a lot. And I kind of abandoned that work. I see all the Russian icons behind you, and I've got them here too. And I kind of abandoned that work because there were, at that time in the early 90s, there were no professors at Berkeley that were interested in it. So I did find one professor in medieval art who was working on some of the mosaics, the Byzantine mosaics in Sicily, which was interesting to me because my dad was born and raised in Sicily, and I'd been over there. So I was looking at the mosaics in Monreale and then in Shafalou, and people that that know anything about like sort of esoteric religion, Shafalou is where the temple of Thelema was for Aleister Crowley, and that's actually kind of the weird roundabout way I got interested in Aleister Crowley. And I was also I don't want to belabor this because I want to talk to you, but in the late 80s, early 90s, you're pretty young, but I'm 52. So there was a big resurgence of interest in the 1960s. This kind of like happens every 20 years. So it's like in the 1970s, there was this nostalgia for the 50s, like Grease, American Graffiti. And then in the late 80s and 90s, you had the interest in the 60s, especially you saw that with a lot of the Vietnam War movies. And then it happened again. I remember in the late 90s, there was a big interest in the 1970s with movies like 54 and The Last Days of Disco and all that stuff. So when I was in college, there was this neo 60s, it was a kind of a weird movement. I mean, I was involved with it too. And part of that was a renewed interest in hallucinogenics. If you remember, like in the 80s, if you look at it in like what sort of drugs, recreational drugs were in fashion, in the 80s, it was a lot of cocaine. That was sort of the drug of choice.
And ecstasy. I mean, that's when the rave scene really got going, was in the 80s.
I was going to get to that. Yeah. No, you're right. So I'm glad you know all this. When I was in Berkeley, so there was the rave, and you had like these, they called them like smart drugs or party drugs. So like ecstasy, like Special K and stuff like that. And I used to go to a lot of raves, and when you're kind of in that place, you don't look at least I did, because I was always a real shallow thinker, but you don't look at things in a historical context. But now looking back, I'm like, wow, those raves were like really psychedelic experiences. Because there wasn't an emphasis on seeing a performer, but it was usually like a DJ or something. So it was all about the music and the lights and you as a participant in this event. You weren't so much an observer watching somebody perform on a stage, you were taking part. And part of that experience was the drug.
Right.
And ecstasy was sort of the perfect, sort of the perfect accompaniment for that, because it did lessen your inhibitions. It made you very, I know I've thought about this a lot, 30, 35 years, later, it made you sort of like love everybody. And there was a sense of love and community, but I don't know, it was so fake. But it really was sort of a 60s experience, like they talked about with LSD back then. And that got me interested. So when I saw what you were working on, I was like, wow, I really like that, because I haven't really seen anybody try to examine what happened and all that. So that's my short introduction why I'm interested. How did you get interested? Because you're like a millennial, right? So I'm a Gen Xer.
Yeah, I'll be 33 this year.
Okay. So I'm the generation before you.
Your question is, how did I get interested in psychedelics?
Well, I mean, not so much, but just the topic of it, just the theory.
Well, the topic came with my participation in it. And so during my undergraduate studies at IUPUI in Indianapolis, I was a biology major. I was really interested in animal life and zoology and all this different stuff. And then I was taking these religion classes. I grew up conservative Methodist, and some of the classes on the Bible and the critical scholarship really undermined a lot of my naive Methodist upbringing. And that got me interested in, from some of my classwork, interested in Eastern mysticism. And so I spent 2 summers in southern China at a university in Guangzhou called Sun Yat-sen or Zhongshan Dashui. And I studied Mandarin and Chinese language and culture. I was really interested in, East Asia, Eastern mysticism. And it was about that time that I started to find, so this is probably 2010, 11, 12, that I found Alan Watts and Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary. And it was a very exciting point of what I thought was a discovery of sort of the frontier of religion. And so looking at taking this sort of perennialistic take where all these religions have a sort of piece of the pie, and then taking psychedelics and having what's perceived to be numinous events, spiritual events. I thought this was sort of the frontier of religious history, of religion, generally speaking. And so I focused a lot of my research on the last 2 years, my undergraduate, from biology to religious studies. And really, especially my time in China, I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school to study religion. And so I went to the University of Illinois after undergrad to study early Christianity. So I was really interested in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, early Christianity, and then psychedelic shamanism. And so basically those are what most of my classwork was focused on. I worked with a Native American professor there. And I created a YouTube channel that's it still exists, but has been renamed, and a lot of the videos have been privatized. But it was called Fractal Universe, and it promoted. I would take visuals and add them to somebody like a Terence McKenna lecture or an Alan Watts or Robert Anton Wilson, and then I would add these visual graphics that really filled out what they were speaking, and made it something that it was like something you'd watch. Normally you would just listen to them speak and there'd just be a graphic, but I wanted to turn them into videos. And so I did that, and they became pretty successful. And so that then colored what I thought I was wanting to do. Was studying my own spirituality in graduate school at the GTU, was focusing on people who are spiritual, not religious, the new age, the use of psychedelics, and what exactly their spirituality is, what is their worldview, how does this relate to the history of ideas? And that led me to really diving deeper and deeper into the 1960s. A lot of my coursework during the PhD program was focused on the 1960s counterculture and looking at the use of psychedelics and how they were brought in by Arden Gordon Wasson in 1957 Life magazine article. Hoffman, Ruck, Carl A.P. Ruck over at Boston University, and just looking at all their work. And I at that time, I was under the suspicion that psychedelics were the basis of all these world religions, and that somehow everything had to do with mushrooms or plants or inebriation at one point or another. And so that led me reading and doing research on a book called The Psychedelic Gospels by Dr. Jerry and Julie Brown. And that shows mushroom fresco evidence in southern France, southern Germany, and northern Italy, as well as evidence in Turkey. And that research showed that a lot of the evidence of psychedelic mushroom use within Christianity was tied with groups that identified as Gnostic or certainly had Gnostic practices. And so I immediately saw the characterization of drugs as the origin of Christianity actually can't be true, even though this was promoted by people like John Marco Allegro with his book, Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And it was describing real historical practices from these Gnostic groups, but that was never what Christianity, the Orthodox Christianity, was about. However, at that time, I was very naive to Orthodox Christianity. So I did that research into the book, The Psychedelic Gospels, which is right here. And then, once I saw that a lot of the evidence was historically contextualized between the 900s and the 1300s, so the 10th and 14th centuries, I came to the conclusion that, that's really interesting. I wonder if it's in Eastern Orthodoxy, because R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, wrote a book called Mushrooms, Russia, and History. And it was about the linguistic evidence of how Slavic cultures are much more mushroom philic than the West, which in a way is mushroom phobic, that we only have 2 or 3 words. Toadstool, mushroom, and fungus is really the only words in English we have for these groups of plants, of entities, where in other cultures, such as Slavic cultures, they have tons and tons of words. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll find some of this stuff in the other East Asian, Eastern Orthodox churches. And so I took a course on Eastern Orthodoxy, and that opened me up to the theology and the history and the development of its theology. And I realized then how sophisticated this was. And that then forced me eventually, long story short, and through going to an ayahuasca ceremony, my own LSD experiences, kind of pushed me away from all the psychedelic stuff and towards Orthodoxy, towards a very traditional understanding of Christianity and the original theology. And in 2019, that's then when I really devoted to trying to build something new that talked about Christ, talked about God, talked about Eastern Orthodoxy and Christianity in light of having done all the psychedelics, having done a lot of drugs, having been participated in a lot of the countercultural activities, and seeing then how are they different, how do they relate, what are the similarities. And so that then kind of brings me then to the present moment. I've been doing that for the last 2 years. Is my academic research is focusing on I'm working on my dissertation, which is really focusing on categorizing drugs as technes. The Greek word techne is just a means to an end. Technology is the study of techne, of things that cause a means to an end. And so there's a famous book called Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy by Mircea Eliade. And that's still considered one of the most prominent books on describing shamanism. And I agree with him that shamanism is about these sort of techniques, or these technologies, or using techne for their spiritual means to transcend matter through technologies. And so tracing that from shamanism to the ancient mystery religions, through the Gnostic groups, through its appearance in various Gnostic traditions in Christianity, opium, hashish use in Islam, through then the Western esoteric traditions, all the way up to Aleister Crowley. And then finding that this strand of techne has been an inspiration for what became the 1960s counterculture. William Burroughs, Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna all gave mention of Aleister Crowley and how they inspired them. And so I think then it's very interesting to categorize drugs as technologies, because once you get into the 20th century with people like Aldous Huxley and the Timothy Learys, Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, you see how then technology actually becomes fused with the psychedelics at the same point that they view the psychedelics as bringing them back to this sort of tribal religion, this ancient religion. At the same time, it's very rare to find prominent psychedelic speakers that aren't in favor of transhumanism, aren't in favor of some type of millenarian, apocalyptic singularity precipice that we're moving towards, and that they're going to attain their own immortality, their own divinity, their own omniscience through, again, these technes, which is exactly what people thought the psychedelics did, whether it be in archaic times or now in the 21st century. Technology and drugs offer that same inspiration today.
Wow. Yeah, because I'm familiar. Yeah, it's a lot. Because I'm familiar on a basic level with a lot of the names that you mentioned. Although I'm stretching myself intellectually to tie it all together like you did. But I'm so glad a lot of the names that you mentioned, because I was going to use Father Seraphim Rose as kind of a launching point. I mean, for me, he was my introduction to Orthodoxy, but reading about his life and also reading about reading his works it was also it was also really kind of fun for me because a lot of the things that he was interested in and that he read about, even the places that he was at in San Francisco, were things that I shared with him. So it's he's kind of like for me, he's like a very universal character. I think a lot of people can find anybody that's a prodigal too can find something in his story, his life story, that they can relate to.
Agreed.
Yeah. So you mentioned Huxley. So in '53, Huxley published The Doors of Perception, which was about his psychedelic experiences with mescaline. And then you mentioned Alan Watts. So Alan Watts, I'm really oversimplifying here, and I'm so forgive me. But Alan Watts was sort of he wasn't a devotee of Huxley, but they knew each other. So Alan Watts, for people that don't know, was sort of a proto Timothy Leary kind of new age guru sort of guy. I think he was down in LA. I don't remember. But I remember that Father Seraphim Rose, when he was at Pomona College, and Father Seraphim, I think people on here that's watching this will know a little bit about him, but let me backtrack real super quick. Father Seraphim Rose was a California boy, California native. He was born in, I think, down in San Diego, and raised Protestant, but sort of, I don't know, they kind of went to different churches. His dad didn't really practice much, but his mother, he was the youngest in the family of three, and he tagged along with her to different Protestant churches. So he was a funny kid, kind of like me too, kind of odd, smart. Well, I wasn't that smart, but very inquisitive and a very deep thinking, sensitive child. And he was interested in religion as a boy. And then in college, he was also interested. And he went to Pomona College and got interested like you did, which my ears, kind of perked up, is when you said you went to China and you were interested in Buddhism and Eastern religion, because so was Father Seraphim. And he went to some lecture with Alan Watts. It was in LA. I don't know if it was at Pomona, but he heard Alan Watts and was like, wow, this guy's really interesting. And so after graduation from Pomona, Father Seraphim followed Alan Watts. Well, didn't follow him, but went up to San Francisco to go to this, was it called the Asian Institute of Studies or something, where Alan Watts was teaching. And it was sort of a new age, gosh, I'm oversimplifying, but it was kind of a new age sort of center in the late 50s, early 60s. And in San Francisco, you had the beatnik movement, which they were getting involved with drugs, mainly marijuana. But so it was that was the flourishing, really early period of the counterculture, which you talked about in San Francisco. And Father was there. And then it gets complicated, but I think Alan Watts was fired from the Asian Studies College. And then Father went over, Father Seraphim Rose, went over to Berkeley, and then he studied there. I thought this was interesting because Father Seraphim Rose did read The Doors of Perception by Huxley. And he said this: the drug, he's talking about LSD, the drug increases sensitivity, not consciousness, or only very secondarily. It causes a change in perception in the subjective state, not a change in being, which is what religion wishes. So Father was already looking very deeply at things. And this is a book I really love, the nihilism book, because I think he understood at such a young age what I guess the essential problem is with the use of drugs, especially psychedelics or hallucinogenics. Father wrote, "The God of nihilism, nothingness, is an emptiness, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Those who have lived in this vacuum, and acknowledged nothingness as their God, cannot but seek a new God and hope that he will lead them out of the age and the power of nihilism. So this is something that I've tried to talk about a lot in my writing, even about my own personal life, where humans have an instinctual, they have an instinctual desire for the transcendent and to know it and to be a part of it. And I think when you're raised like me, I was raised marginally Roman Catholic, but not, it never, Catholicism was never really a part of my life. So and it never really met the needs that I had to know or understand the transcendent. So when I got older, especially in the midst of this sort of 1960s revivalism in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, the new age, drugs, but then also sort of subcultures like the gay subculture or the BDSM subculture. Mm-hmm. All of those things had religious aspects to them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they sort of mimicked, or not so much mocked, but Christian symbolism. And like what I'm thinking of, and I've written about her a lot, is Madonna, the singer. So if you look at like her video for Like a Prayer, I mean, you're too young, but I mean, you can see it on YouTube. Mm-hmm. It's you know, the video is sort of a hallucination, but she's playing with a lot of Christian symbolism in that video. I mean, and she did throughout her career. She was raised Roman Catholic. She's a little older than me, but you know, sort of in that very ineffectual time in the 60s and the 70s, you know, she was raised as a Roman Catholic. So she was playing with a lot of that Christian symbolism. So I think that relates to what Father is saying about there being, especially in the West, this vacuum that gets filled with other things, especially like drugs. Because I remember like it was like in the mid 90s, I was driving up Geary in San Francisco, and it's a long street. And Geary, it kind of ends up at the Legion of Honor, which is the European Museum in San Francisco, and that's where the De Young has like all the American art, and the Legion of Honor has the European. So I used to go up there a lot when I was studying art history at Berkeley, because they always had different exhibitions and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I used to drive by the cathedral, the ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral. I didn't know what it was. I told this story before because I saw like the gold onion domes, and I thought it was like a Islamic or Muslim church. So, I mean, I don't know why I didn't see the crosses. And then one day a friend of mine, because at Berkeley, I got interested in Russian iconography, and he said, go over there. I was like, oh. So I went in there, and I remember it's, you know, Orthodox architecture is so different from Gothic. It's not so much soaring and like filled with big windows and a lot of light. It's more Romanesque. It's darker. It's more mysterious. And in that particular church, you have all the icons and then the painted frescoes, and you have a lot of candlelight. And that, to me, I don't want to profane it, but to me, and in the place I was at in the 90s, it was kind of a psychedelic experience. I didn't need drugs, you know, and there's always that lingering scent of the incense and in the air. So sorry to ramble on. No, but what do you think about what I guess Father Seraphim was saying about there being a vacuum, especially in Western culture where God is dead, mm-hmm. God's been killed. So you have all these feeble replacements, which includes like hallucinogenics of the New Age, or.
Mm-hmm. I'm a fan of Generally speaking, I mean, in regards to this particular theory of Max Weber's disenchantment hypothesis. And so he argued in the 19th century that he has a book called Protestantism, the Spirit of Protestantism and it's about capitalism and the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism is what it's called. And he describes what he considers the process of rationalization, and that, again, post-Enlightenment, and we can look at post-Protestant Reformation, Protestantism itself is a massively rationalistic approach to Christianity, and how it, the solas, how it rationalizes, there's very little mysticism. And this is also why we see the occult and what was considered Western esotericism really emerge about at the Italian Renaissance. So we're in the mid 1400s, 15th century, and then it's just 50 years, 60 years later, and now we have the Protestant Reformation. And Weber's theory of this disenchantment is that the power of rationalism is forcing mysticism and magic, or things that are beyond explanation, out of people's lives in favor of industrialization, mass consumption, industry, and all these different things. And these are all rationalized processes. And then they have their own rational ends for why the corporation needs to put out new products for this market to make sure that they get enough money for the next quarter. All that stuff is rational in regards that it's using reason as a faculty. But Weber argued that this was part of a disenchantment, and that the West was going to go through a radical disenchantment due to its emphasis on reason. And I think so. Then when you look at Father Seraphim Rose's book on nihilism, often a lot of nihilists are very rational. They're almost hyper rational. And so we look at the contemporary world, and I think when we start seeing potential agendas to form one world government, central planning, collectivistic ideology, these are, again, all part of this spirit of reason, and we saw in the French Revolution, they worshiped reason as a goddess. They did that at the Notre Dame Cathedral. So I see Nietzsche's The Death of God announcement in the 19th century was after Weber's disenchantment, or around the same time as disenchantment hypothesis of Weber. And so I agree with both of them. I think they're both true. I think that the Western God is dead and is not appealing to people. And I think that's why Christianity is slowly falling away from its prominence in American life and Western civilization, generally speaking. I think people are running back to it, and beginning with Protestantism, and then they'll go to Catholicism. I think the deeper seekers then eventually get to Orthodoxy, because they start recognizing the evils, they start recognizing the chaos, they start recognizing that there's a lot of foundations to Christianity that are the basis of our civilization, that without Christianity we're going to lose. And unfortunately, I think Protestantism isn't going to totally work. Protestantism and secularism go hand in hand. And so that's why I don't even see any Protestant nation still Christian. I think you could argue some of the former Catholic nations are still Christian, dominantly Christian. The Eastern Orthodox nations, you could say, are still Christian. I would have trouble pointing to any Protestant European nation and saying that they're still Christian. And so when we look at drugs and raves and promiscuous sexual activity, the multiplicity of gender identity, these are ways to re-enchant the world, because reason has been disenchanting it. And so therefore, to re-enchant the world, people are looking for irrational processes. They don't want rational processes, they want irrational processes. And so the ecstasy of having sex, the getting into a psychedelic state and going to a rave, being led purely by your emotions, or getting into these emotional highs, these are ways to infuse the world with new meaning that people are perceiving as absence. It's no longer there. And so wow, this is why I think Orthodoxy is so special, because it is considered the mystical theology of Christianity. It is the mystical church, because unlike Catholicism, which begins to trying to explain, for example, the Eucharist with transubstantiation, that is a rationalizing process. It comes up to a definition and it says, oh, at this point we ring the bell, and now it moved from bread to body, from wine to blood. And Orthodoxy says, no, this is a mystery, that we call it a rational bloodless sacrifice when we celebrate the Eucharist. So we say it's rational, it's not irrational, and we say it's bloodless. At the same time, we say that it's the blood and the body. And we do recognize that it is the blood and the body of Christ, but we say that only happens through a mystery, that when it is wine and it is bread, but through a mystery, it is the blood and the body. And so Orthodoxy is always about bringing you up to the point that can be rationalized or described, and then saying, well, now it's a mystery. This is part of the theology. And almost every avenue of the church takes you down these little rabbit holes where then it just says, well, it's both and it's a mystery.
That's a lot. Okay. I tried to take notes on what you were saying. Let me try to unpack it, at least for me, a little bit, what you're saying. Because there's always, for me, there's like always certain key words that pop up. See, I'm amazed that your mind is working as well as it is, because I mean, you did take like hallucinogenics, so did I. Yeah. And I have to say, I'm not making excuses that I'm kind of dense, but I want to talk about this with you a little later. It does affect your brain, your thinking process. I think people think it makes you more enlightened. Actually, it makes you duller. So mysticism, and I think especially because I mean, I've always been kind of in the Roman Catholic space, but I think there was a certain mysticism in Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, and I would say it's still there, especially compared to Protestantism.
Yeah. Before Vatican II, especially,
yes, that's where things haywire.
Yeah, that's where things became much more Protestant, and that's the church that I was raised in.
Yeah,
and that's like the church that Madonna was raised in.
Right. And that's the church most kids now, or anybody, a millennial or Gen Z, or when you say Catholicism, that's what they're thinking is post-Vatican II Catholicism.
Yeah. So our generation, the Gen X, when we got older, like Madonna got into Kabbalah, and I got into New Age and occult and Crowley and all this other stuff. And so there is this desire, what I'm talking about, this instinctual desire for the transcendent.
Yes.
But I think the way that as human beings, we experience that a lot of times is through a mystical experience. So if we can't find it in a brick and mortar church, in the institutional church, we'll look for it in other places.
Sure.
So so some people get into the music scene. I got a lot into the gay scene and niche fetish cultures. Which, again, when I'm like in that space, I didn't see it. So like later, like the image that strikes me, not to be too graphic, but I used to go to these sex fairs in San Francisco, like the Folsom Street Fair, and you would have people like tied up to like the St. Andrew's cross, which is like this, and being flagellated. And I was like, wow, this is like a sick reenactment of like Christian martyrdom. So there's a lot of like all this ritual, esoteric sort of practices in these sort of niche communities that, whether they know it or not, reenacts Christian themes.
Right.
So where did I wrote down here? But the interesting thing about this too is that even that in that space, it's essentially a shallow reenactment, because I think it has all the vestiges of an actual Christian ritual, but it doesn't really have any of the meaning. And I'm being as intellectual as I can be. So in order to enhance that, you need to add more stuff, or it needs to become darker. So you can add hallucinogenics, because I saw that too in the early 90s, is that just being at, like, say, a rave wasn't enough. The music and the lights and the availability of sex or even alcohol wasn't enough. Then you needed to add something else. You had to have Special K or ecstasy or something like that. But then even eventually that begins to not work. And then I got into like LSD and angel dust and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't work. I think eventually, like the nihilist experiment, like Father Rose was saying, it does go back to nihilism. And what you end up is very angry and bitter. And that's what I think the world is seeing right now, especially people that have been through kind of that loop where you're looking for something to fill this void or a vacuum. You kind of find something, it doesn't work, so you up the ante, and you keep upping it, and it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. I would say that's part of the as Orthodox, we believe that this whole spiritual warfare is about the personhood, and so about the image of God that's within every person. And so when we look at the exact process you're talking about, how you have to sort of amp up different things. I mean, just to put them in general categories, we'll just call sins, and that as we sin, we are missing the mark of God's will, our will, which is made in the image of his will, which only has, he is the source of free will. That then through our free will, we get to choose his will, or we can choose our own will. And when we choose our own will and our own pleasure, our own whatever that be, we slowly then miss the mark, we sin, and that sin is a distortion, and that slowly kills us, and it takes out the image of God within us. And that is the whole point of the whole spiritual warfare, because the way we engage with God as Orthodox is through his uncreated energies, which means mercy and compassion and truth and honor and glory and love and logic and reason. So as we are more of those things, we're engaging with an energetic reality that then makes us more like God. But when we choose and close off to those things, when we do things or choose things that aren't actually true, when we become more irrational, when we become less compassionate, we're actually cutting ourselves off from the energy of God, which then distorts us, which is the whole point of death. That is how sin equals death, is that we're literally dying because we don't have the energies of God within us, that if we do die, we can continue to live. Because if we're filled with the energies of God, how could you die when you die? You couldn't. And that's the whole point of the incarnation of God becoming man, so that man can become divinized through those energies and live eternally. And so whether it be whatever niche community, whatever fetish, whatever drug scene, it's always essentially moving further and further and further to the point of destroying the personhood. And so when you get into theologies of nothingness, or Maya, or that your ego, or me being David Patrick Carey is an illusion, to me, these are then sinful, satanic ideologies that are trying to get people to destroy the image of God in them, to then associate or identify themselves with like this concept of unity. I'm pure consciousness. I'm enlightened. I'm one with the universe, all this type of stuff.
Okay. I'm trying. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit too about some of these figures, these false prophets. That it kind of ties into what Father Seraphim, the milieu he was in. So we talked about Huxley, we talked about Alan Watts.
Yep.
And then sort of from that strain, we have Timothy Leary, I think, who everybody, well, a lot of people of a certain age. I met the guy. He was sort of a sad.
Oh, you met Leary?
Yeah, he was older.
Was that in the 90s?
Yeah, he was signing blotter papers. It was kind of a bizarre thing. So, do you remember that blotter art? It was kind of a thing in the 90s. So
yeah.
I think he had done some blotter art. So I met him, and he was signing blotter art there in San Francisco. So a book of his that had a big influence on me was the Psychedelic Experience. A manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Yeah. So that's 1964. And I looked at the book again. Whether you experience heaven or hell, remember that it is your mind which creates them. I don't know. I think that's kind of true sometimes, because my book was called Disordered, and I got that term from St. Augustine, because he talked about this disordered mind being its own prison. And I think that's kind of true. He also wrote, all deities and demons, all heavens and hells are eternal. So he's going back to that whole thing that it's in your head.
Mm-hmm.
As a guide and protection, trust your divinity, trust your brain. That messes you up, because I really got into that really heavy, where
Right.
you're like your own God. You can create your own reality,
Right.
and you can create your own altered states of reality.
Right.
That sounds kind of dumb, but when you get into it, it really messes you up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what that is it's the recapitulation of the Luciferian fall. Lucifer wanted to be worshipped over the Trinity. The difference is he did that inside of eternity. And so because of that, Lucifer then becomes Satan, becomes the devil, is relegated to earth, which was a domain that he was going to have dominion over if he didn't fall. But now he has dominion over it in his fallen state. And he, again, from the theological standpoint, is already going to be annihilated. His personhood, the image of God in which he was made in, is going to be annihilated on Judgment Day. And so the point is then to get as many people as possible for that personhood to be annihilated. And so you get it through getting people to worship themselves, because the only way you're not annihilated is to worship the true God, is to engage in a real reality. And I think the metaverse, the psychedelic substances, rave culture, the new age, it's getting people to become enamored with the reality that they've constructed, which isn't actual reality.
That's it, David. And I thought about this too in terms of technology and why, because when I was in the gay culture, we didn't have this proliferation,
Proliferation. Yeah.
proliferation of identities.
Yeah.
So now we've got LGBTQIA, I don't know, and I'm not mocking that, for people to take it seriously, but I think technology, you're right, has a lot to do with it, because in the world of social media, you can create your own reality, even like with your meme, and then with all these different identifiers. So in when I when I was in that scene in San Francisco, there was still it was sort of a hallucinogenic fantasy world, but it still had a basis in reality. So if you were like experimenting with your gender, that had to take on some sort of physical form. Mm-hmm. Like you had to dress differently, or you had to put makeup, and you had to go out in the real world. But now people can take on these sort of avatars at home. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think that's made people go crazy.
I definitely agree. I think I think the multiplicity of genders is just getting people to, in a way, go ahead and destroy that which God created. Right. So again, if you were a young kid and you thought you were a girl or something, and your parents were part of this ideological program, and they give you hormone blockers, and then you grow up and now you can't have an orgasm and you can't reproduce, what are you going to do? I mean, I think a lot of people are going to kill themselves, which is the point of all of this. The point is madness. The point is chaos. The point is death. And so, with the gender confusion and the multiplicity of identities right now, I believe it's part of a paradigm that is continuing against that sort of that rational process of allowing irrationality to become normality. So now men give birth, women have penises. There is no category that is unpermeable now. Every category bleeds into the next category, which is ultimately relativism and subjectivism. And if there is no objective truth, then there is no objective God. If there is no objective God, there is no objective good. Then the only thing that exists is power. And that's the world we live in. And that's been described. Nietzsche was hitting on that. Foucault was hitting on that, and he was a homosexual that was in favor of sleeping with young boys, the famous French intellect. So it's the same thing. Is the point is to get into a relativistic place where then who can say anything about anything? And I think that is just pure madness and chaos. And we're seeing that affect young people most obviously because they don't know any better, and they're diving into it head first.
Yeah, Foucault died of AIDS too, as well.
Yeah, from contracting it at the bathhouses in San Francisco.
Yeah. So the thing that struck me when you were speaking is that I think there is sort of this weird miasma online where you can take on all these different identities, and I think like I'll reference back to when I was out in the 90s is that. And I knew people that were transgender, although I think at that time I wouldn't refer to them, I wouldn't out loud, but in my mind, I thought of them as transsexual. So I didn't know any women that were that way, but I knew men that were transsexuals and now identified it as women, and I referred to them that way. So they took on the vestiges
right
in every way that you could, I guess, think of medically as a woman. But now, because it's become so complicated and so like sick, is that in order to materialize these complex sort of identity, sexual and orientation systems into reality, I keep thinking of like Frankenstein, the monster. And I don't want to belittle these people because I do outreach. So I have kind of a weird, just to tell you, David, I have kind of a weird insight because I was in that scene in the 90s, and then I returned like 20 years later, well, not quite 20, like 15 years later, as a missionary into that community. So I've seen how it's changed. And now when I go to outreach in that community, I see things physically that are monstrous. And I'm not even talking so much about the body modification stuff that I've never really seen, but I've just seen people that are playing with ideals of gender, and they did that, I guess, started online, but then it took like a physical form, and it's pretty monstrous, and my heart goes out to them. I've always put more onus on the theoreticians of this stuff than the actual, who I think are the actual victims of it.
Right.
The people who buy into it and then enact those theories.
Right. Well, I think it's part of a larger sterility agenda. There's no, this is, people might think it's a conspiracy theory, and I can certainly go into more deeper aspects of the conspiracy, but clearly, whether it be Ted Turner or Bill Gates or whoever, a lot of the most wealthiest and prominent people on the planet believe that there's too many people, and the best way is to sterilize. They've done that through medical procedures. They've done that through the promotion of certain sexual identifiers and identities, practices. And then getting the women to become more career oriented. All this is doing is creating society where sex becomes associated with pleasure and disassociated with reproduction. And so once that is taken place, now it's like the game is all about sexual pleasure. And so getting finding a man with breast implants that could be your thing now, and that's your sexual identity, and this is who you are and how proud you are of it. It's all sterility. It's all anti-life, because again, from an Orthodox standpoint, life can only come from God. And so I would argue that when you start to look at all these practices, they're all essentially anti-life, because they're all coming from a place which is inherently anti the Trinitarian Christian God, anti the true God.
Yeah. The another thinker I want to go to is Terence McKenna. I think he's still alive.
No, he died in 2000.
Okay. Let's see. So a book that had a big influence on me, and this is right when I was living in Berkeley, 1993, True Hallucinations Being an Account of the author's extraordinary ventures in the devil's paradise. I mean, talk about a title. So one of the
he was quite a wordsmith.
Yeah. So and I have to say, these people like Timothy Leary and McKenna, you can't just like brush them off as like quacks. They actually had interesting things to say.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. I mean, they were intelligent people. I think their brains got kind of fried eventually,
right.
but
well, I would say this that is the mature, even academic approach to a lot of things. So I deal with scholarship. You know, I for example, Max Weber, not a big fan of him as a person or his own personal ideology, but he has theories that I think are really useful. I don't like Foucault or Jacques Derrida was the deconstruct. I'm not a deconstructionist. I'm not a postmodernist, but he has ideas that are useful. And I think the mature point is to just look at people's ideas and that nothing is usually black and white. Everything is a little bit more gray. And so piecing and parsing where people have interesting ideas and good things to say and where, okay, well, that I totally disagree with that. And that's retarded.
Yeah. So the thing about that book that struck me was that book was kind of like a trip, not just like a psychedelic trip, but it was like a trip of the mind, because he was going I think he was in the Amazon.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. He
Yeah.
was in the Peruvian rainforest, Amazonian rainforest.
He was having these trips, these consciousness trips, but these physical trips. And I kind of got into that too. I never went to like South America, but I went to Sedona, Arizona a lot. And that was now it's kind of, I don't know what the hell it is now. Now it's kind of like a hip, like yuppie, I don't know what it is. It's kind of more, it's
New
more
Age hub. It's certainly a New Age guru hub, yeah.
Yeah, when I went there in the 90s, it was kind of like Roswell. It was kind of like UFOs. And what the hell did they call it? Harmonic convergence. Doesn't that sound great? So I went there. So yeah, I was kind of like trying to get myself physically into like spaces that assisted into like blowing my mind. So and a thing that he was into in that book was Disney's Alice in Wonderland, which was so weird because like I had like a total obsession with that movie, because that movie, kind of like what we were talking about, it's about creating your own reality and like taking a trip through it, and eating this, drinking this, and yeah, it's out there.
Yeah.
So and then he was into DMT in that book, and then I've tried it. I kind of want to get into a little bit about bad trips, but DMT, and see, this is how everything goes like full circle. So if you see on like social media, and I think it's Joe Rogan mainly, has talked a lot about DMT, how it like opens your mind. You can explore all these new realities. But then on like Twitter, because a lot of times I follow like physicians, like actual medical people, not like quacks, medical people, and psychologists and things, because I've had a lot of, I mean, people that have watched my podcast, I've had like some mental issues my whole life. So there are like some psychologists, psychiatrists are recommending some of these substances for people with like PTSD. And one thing they've recommended is ketamine, which I just don't get it. But I don't know. Maybe there's a different type of dosage than if you're taking it recreationally than if you're taking it under a doctor's care. But I can't imagine giving it to people. So I just wanted what you thought about McKenna and all that stuff about tripping. I mean, people do that too. I think you saw. I mean, I see it. A lot of people converge. That was like more in the Summer of Love in like '67. But I think San Francisco is still a draw for people. But even these sort of events, like you have like these love-ins, like in Germany and all this stuff, where they have these big gatherings of people. So it becomes not just like a psychological trip, but you like take a trip somewhere.
Yeah. Well, a lot to unpack there. I think with
Sorry,
McKenna.
sorry about that. Sorry.
Yeah, well, no, it's all good. With McKenna, I think he has ideas that I agree with. I used to be a very big McKenna advocate. The ones that I agree with now, even as somebody who's very critical of his work and ideas, is the concept of the archaic revival, that we are moving into a reintegration into archaic times, arguably pre-literate times. I do think that's the case. And then his description of psychedelics as dissolving boundaries. I believe that is also true. When it gets into his stoned ape theory or his timeline zero, that he was able to map all of history onto an algorithm. He had a lot of ideas that I totally dismiss, but I think the one about psychedelics dissolving boundaries is useful when we start looking at some of the clinical trials at Johns Hopkins universities, using psilocybin and MDMA particularly, because somebody who has PTSD has a mental barrier that they're reliving, and so the psychedelics can help dissolve those barriers. And I don't disagree that it could potentially help somebody in that state. I also believe that when you dissolve those boundaries, you're also opening yourself up to a spiritual reality. And so I believe that spiritual possession,
that's it.
Demonic ideas, all this stuff, it's all part of this bag. So
that's what I want to talk about.
Yeah. So dissolving boundaries is exactly what, then when we look at the world and we look at what's being called as the Great Reset, it's all about dissolving boundaries between genders, dissolving boundaries between sexual partners. We're seeing the normalization of incest in the news, dissolving the boundaries between nations. If you remember, their chant was no border, no wall, no U.S. state at all, because part of the Great Reset is there is no national borders, and because this is part of essentially the world is going through a sort of psychedelic phenomenon of the dissolution of all boundaries. Christ as the logos, the entire logos theology that comes from the Greek philosophers, was all about boundaries. It's the idea that no, beauty has an objective aesthetic, truth has an objective form, the good has an objective morality, and that we should then try to find these objective structures and then build within those boundaries. And that's what then sacred space is. Whether you go to a mosque or a church or a Buddhist temple, you can feel the presence of something transcendent due to their use of proportions and sacred geometry and shapes. This is because of the logos, what we believe to be the incarnation as Jesus Christ. The logos is the metaphysical frame of order. And so I look at the psychedelics as an Orthodox Christian, maybe, back in pre-literate times, it was the useful way to try to get access to the transcendent realm. Then you saw that as society developed, as cities formed, the psychedelic drugs became lesser and lesser and lesser because they weren't efficacious in the building process of societies. And so now you look at what's happening in the proliferation of psychedelics into the world, and we see the destruction and the de-evolution of society. It's totally consistent. And I believe Terence McKenna, when he was talking about the archaic revival, I agree with him when he compares that to Marshall McLuhan's work, and how the use of electricity and electronic technologies is going to bring back the sensory ratios of a pre-literate man. That manuscript culture, reading books, radio, the man that was interested in those forms of media information acquisition, that man is gone. He's dead. We're now bombarded with these electrical technologies, the metaverse, VR, television, that hit us with so much information, and it's a visual stimulation that we are going to become. And I've already done streams showing the literacy rates have dropped dramatically within the last 5 years within the Western world, noticeably in the United States. Every year for the last 5 years, literacy is getting lower and lower and lower. And we look at social media, we can look at the technology, and this was theorized by Marshall McLuhan when he looked at electronic technology. And it was theorized by Terence McKenna regarding psychedelics, rave culture, the multiplicity of genders, homosexuality, all this different stuff, that he said this was all going to dissolve boundaries and bring us back to an archaic state. And I think that's exactly what's happening.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, my head exploded when you were talking, and like my brain stuck to the ceiling. Because I mean, a lot of the things that I think about, you were saying, and you can say them in a much more, elegant fashion, rational fashion. I can. But first, I tried to write some of these things down. But first of all, when you talked about like opening corridors or opening doors to the demonic, is that was very much I don't have a good opinion of psychedelics because that was very much my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because before anybody thinks about taking hallucinogenics, these sorts of things, you need to ask the question why. And I think you also, but see, people don't do this that are most likely to do these things, because for me, it was like just at the spur of a moment. I didn't think, whoa, today I'm going to go to a party and I'm going to, there's going to be LSD on a sugar cube or something, so, it just happens at the moment and you go, yeah, I'll try it. So, but I mean, I was into some dark stuff. I was into the occult. I was into Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
And I was into sex magic and all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So when I took hallucinogenics, oh man, it's just like whoosh. Every demon that I thought I had at bay at a very when I kept pushing down, they just sprung forth. So some people say, oh man, well, you just had a bad trip. But I don't know. I think it's more than that. I don't think it's a bad trip. It's something, it was very real.
Yeah. And that's where I disagree with the people who try to dismiss the psychedelics, as I recognize that was a reality, right? So your experience with those demons, it's not that the psychedelics cause you to have some sort of schizophrenic mind hallucination that is ambivalent and totally divorced from reality. I would say, no, it dissolves boundaries, and it's dissolving boundaries between you and a non-local reality. And that reality then is already around you due to the activities that you're doing. So your soul was in a spiritual state that was surrounded by those demons, that when you go into those psychedelic states, they're present with you at that moment. And I think that's why then somebody who, they may not be Christian, but maybe their soul's in a place which is much different. Maybe they're more naive, they're whatever. And they then take the psychedelics and they have a beautiful, blissful experience and they perceive this to be God. And both of them, those dissolving boundaries, both are opening up to a reality that I think only lead them closer to where you were experiencing. I think they all lead in that direction the more you take it. Even though, again, the clinical trials for people with PTSD, I don't disagree that it couldn't help to a certain extent, but Lord have mercy, somebody who takes a high dose psychedelic experience in a sterile clinical room, that would be horrendous.
So because I've read some contemporary experiences of people in hallucinogenics that are talking about machine elves or something like that. And to me, in my mind, I was like, okay, I went to that reality, and that reality, not at the time, but in hindsight, is demonic.
Yes.
You think it is? Okay.
I do. I actually do. And I tried to get to that realm because at the time I didn't think it was demonic. I thought this was like a realm of access to noetic beings that I wanted to get to. And so listening to Terence McKenna talk about DMT, 5 dried grams of psilocybin, and getting into specifically DMT, the realm of the machine elves, or with the gnomes, with the mushrooms, that I really, really, really wanted this so that they could talk to me, so that I could ask them questions, that I could know more. See, it was about this sort of self-empowerment that I really wanted. It's a very Gnostic, magical idea. But again, through God's mercy and providence, I did a lot of drugs, and I did it high doses. It wasn't totally irresponsible. I knew what I was doing because I was deliberate about it, but I never reached those states. And I was trying to, in a systematic way. And I think it's because God protected me for some reason, or that was just my providence, or whatever that be. That I do believe the transcendental, or the self-transforming machine elves, it is some type of access to real entities. If they weren't real, people say, well, maybe this is just because it's a meme. And so when people then take the drugs, they're just re-experiencing the meme that McKenna or whoever talked about. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think that there's multiple cultures that talk about these little entities, and that there really is something about these little tykes or gnomes or elves,
Yes.
that really is tied with the psychedelic experience, and is what I would argue is some type of demon to some degree.
Yes. This reminds me of McKenna too, because he talked about Alice in Wonderland. And because I think when we like go to that space, it's like, well, these entities are sort of benign. It's kind of like, okay, but
like the
really,
Mad Hatter or something,
or the Cheshire Cat, I'm thinking, because he's but he's like really super sinister. And you know what? This goes back to my childhood in the 80s. There's a scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark when it's at the end, when they open the Ark of the Covenant and all the Nazis are around, and Indiana Jones is tied up with his lady friend in the back, and he's like, close your eyes. And then all these like angels are like flying around, and they're like, you got to watch that scene again. And they're like, ooh, wow. And then one of them, it lifts its face, and it's a beautiful woman, and it turns into like this skeleton. And I was kind of like, that was my experience with hallucinogenics. It turns like really quick. Yeah. And that's kind of like what the devil does.
Yeah, he's a trickster. He can't create, he can only mimic, mirror, or invert.
And this stuff is like, it feels good. Yeah, I mean, that's why people want to do it. But then eventually you end up like all these poor souls in San Francisco living in your own excrement. And it's like, that's the end.
Yes. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I still tell people that some of the most exhilarating or funnest times of my life were tied with drugs and psychedelics. But I totally agree with you that that's how it gets you in. It's through the emotional pleasure, the emotional highs, the what's believed to be at the time the sort of intellectual enlightenment feelings. And it's all a sort of a trick to get you to not take responsibility for your life. And so the whole thing about Christianity and the judgment, and why as Orthodox we're always asking for repentance and Lord have mercy on us, is because we're then coming from a paradigm where I'm made in the image of God, and how I use my intellect and my free will and my language, everything that only God is able to do, that I'm also able to do, that the animals can't, I'm responsible for. And I will be judged accordingly, how I treat people, what I say to people, what I do, how I violate objective morality. And the psychedelics, it's such an easy spirituality. I mean, all you do is pursue your own pleasure. And oh no, you have to meditate for an hour. Then you can go do your. I mean, it's so easy and it's fun. And I think that's partly why, as you get into Orthodoxy, it's like, dang, that's actually not that fun, but it's more meaningful. It feels more real. Yeah. But it's real. It's not as much fun. Maybe you have fun in the people that you meet. And I don't mean it's like all dreary, like we all hate our lives, or it's not like that. It's just, we're not seeking ecstasy in a variety of ways, whether it be emotional or sexual or intellectual. It's more like we're trying to find the literal middle path and stay there as much as possible.
Yeah, the first time I went to a really serious, hardcore Russian Orthodox liturgy, I was on a high afterwards. It felt really good. And it's healthy.
Yeah, so it probably felt good to find the truth. For me too. I coming from the psychedelics, the iconography of Holy Virgin Cathedral in San Francisco was breathtaking. It was like, oh wow, the aesthetics, the beauty, I love this. So in that sense, it's sort of emotional high. But I mean, Orthodoxy as a lifestyle, as a spiritual pursuit, as a vehicle, is nothing like the sort of highs that you would have in the New Age, the spiritual, not religious, or the psychedelic, which is how they keep you coming. So just like that demonic experience, you know, and how they'll shift on you, or they'll change right at a sudden against you. Well, then you end up doing it again. You know, you find yourself 2 months later doing it again. Why? Because that emotional bliss you felt before, and sometimes you'll feel after, and you kind of forget about that really ambiguous point. Or maybe you don't forget it, but you see how it's like it's always leading you through your hedonism, through pleasure from some sort of another.
And you believe that you can control it.
Yeah.
That you're in control. I always believe that I'm in control. Yeah, right. Whatever.
And Crowley himself, that's why he died as an addict, right? His whole thelema and the worship of will, he claimed that he induced his own heroin addiction just to show how strong his will was. But once he died and people came out and you have all the letters, no, he was a massive addict of cocaine, heroin, anything that would get him high. And that was until the day that he died. Yeah. And he wrote to doctors that he wanted to get, you know, he didn't want to be addicted to heroin, and he couldn't.
I want to try to bring it around back to Father Seraphim, because there's been a lot of interest lately in UFOs. It's kind of interesting because I think there's a parallel thought movement here. I'm thinking like in the 1970s when I was a kid, there was a big interest in UFOs, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And this is when Father Seraphim was writing most of this stuff. So he was in that first sort of, well, no. I'm screwing up. So Father talked about this too. So in the 1950s, like in sci-fi, there was a big resurgence of interest in aliens, and that was kind of a time of great social change and tumult. You had the Cold War, and then in the 70s there's this other time of social upheaval, the sexual revolution, women's movement, gay movement, and all this stuff. And then you had this big interest in UFOs. And now we're in a similar like place culturally and socially and politically. And now again, there's this big interest in UFOs again, especially online. And I've seen Father Seraphim's theories about UFOs kind of mocked online, but I'm open-minded to things, and I can see the possibility of extraterrestrials, but I kind of think it would go in like one of two ways. Like The Day the Earth Stood Still, that 50s movie, where the alien shows up because humankind is on the verge of like self-annihilation. So he's like saying, stop it. And then if you watch like Star Trek, the movie, what was the heck of that? The one with the Borg, First Contact. So it's kind of like there's aliens watching Earth, and when mankind reaches a certain technological stage, which for the aliens who were the Vulcans who were watching Earth is faster than light travel, space travel. So when a civilization can do that, then they'll make like first contact and they'll make themselves appear. So that sounds kind of rational, like that could work. I don't think UFOs would just be flying around and randomly abducting people and all this stuff. That sounds crazy to me. But I got into that stuff. So I was never into like so give people like a quick historical context. So you have like L. Ron Hubbard, who was a sci-fi writer first, and then now people know him mainly as the founder of Scientology. A writer that I got into I was completely nuts when I look back at the stuff I read, Whitley Strieber. So he wrote a book called The Hunger, which was about vampires, which I really got into in the movie. But then he also wrote this book called Communion, which was about his alien abduction. So, and then this is interesting too. In the 90s, this is when I was in San Francisco, there was this UFO cult religion in 97 called Heaven's Gate, which always kind of fascinated me too. But I think Father Seraphim, I don't know if he talked about this specifically in this book here, but I think it's kind of implied, because there is something weird going on with, like, specifically these alien abduction stories, because there's always like a sexual nature, like a probing and stuff. It's, to me, it sounds demonic. So Father talked about that. He said the UFO encounters are but a contemporary form of an occult phenomena which has existed throughout the centuries. Men have abandoned Christianity and look for saviors from outer space, and therefore the phenomenon supplies images of spacecraft and space beings. He goes on, never since the beginning of the Christian era have demons appeared so openly and extensively as today. We live near the end of this fearful age of demonic triumph and rejoicing, when the eerie humanoids, another of the masks of the demons, have become visible to thousands of people. So he wrote that in the I don't remember when he wrote that, but it was probably like late 70s, early 80s. But now, what does this have to do with hallucinogenics? Well, because a lot of people that claim, well, they don't claim to be on, a lot of people that, and I talked about my own experiences, a lot of people that do hallucinogenics claim to see these alien beings.
Right.
Oh, what the hell are they? So we just talked about that. But Father Seraphim discussed that. So I think there's something larger going on where the I'm trying not to sound like a jerk, the hallucinogenic beings, I think, that people see when they're under the influence of these psychedelics have been manifested in the real world, where people are seeing them. Follow me?
Yeah, no, I do get it. So I definitely don't believe in aliens or UFOs. My worldview, they don't exist. And that, agreeing with Father Seraphim Rose, all UFO or alien contact is essentially an occult phenomenon related to demons. And I think that's, again, then why people on psychedelics so often see spaceships, discs, actual encounters with aliens, whether that with other people or by themselves or whatnot. I do believe those to be real encounters with entities. I don't believe them to be from different planets. I believe them to be part of a spiritual realm. And I believe that the entire UFO phenomenon of the 20th century is a major psyop to get people to fall into this paradigm. So then you can get people who are quote unquote Christians, but then really they actually have more ultimate authority to the alien that's going to come with all the technology and tell us how to organize ourselves and tell us how, everything's a social construct, that the Great Reset, that I have a theory that the Antichrist himself is going to be fully machine and fully man, just like Christ is fully God, fully man. And then humanity is right in the middle. And that as the Antichrist emerges, we're going to worship him as God, because he's going to be the full fusion of what fallen man created machines, transhumanism with human DNA. And so that the aliens then are the perfect narrative, the perfect mythology to get people to move into this worldview of oh, look how small and infinite we live in an infinite eternal universe with the multiverse, and it just keeps going and going, and that, well, there'd have to be life somewhere, and that, oh, and then if they come, again, you're not going to rely on God, you're going to rely on they know better, that they come from the Pleiades, and this is all part of a worldview that then it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or you're a Buddhist or you're a Christian, your ultimate authority is going to come back to this sort of alien, or this idea of technology and of knowledge and of the universe, material understanding. which is only part of the Great Reset. And that's why I think as soon as 2020 happened, as soon as the lockdowns happened, oh, now the DOJ is releasing videos of UFOs. This is all part of a psychological operation. And anybody that's gone into mind programming operations knows that you have to cause chaos. You have to put somebody in a fearful state so that they'll adopt the program. You do this through, it's called trauma-based mind programming. That's what 2020 was. We're still in it. That's what the Great Reset is for the next 7 years. The next 7-8 years, it's all going to be part of a trauma-based mind control operation to get us to adopt this software that's being put out for people to look at the world through. And I believe that the idea that the UFOs are going to save us, that the aliens are going to come save us, is so that people then depend on these demons for knowledge as opposed to God themselves. And that they're going to then appeal to the worldly system, which is ultimately run by the evil one, that they're going to then fall victim to that. And they're going to be worshiping part of this sort of inverted system because they believe that the aliens are going to save them, not God's going to save them.
Wow. Okay. That's tough for me to, it reminds me to go back to Star Trek. So like Star Trek, it reminds me of the Borg, those half men. Do you know Star Trek? The Star Trek?
No, I don't.
Okay, it's the Borg are like these automated. It's like a communal culture where you're assimilated into a hive mind, and the way that they're humanoid, but the way that they collectivize everybody is through technology. So you're all kind of interconnected through machinery and stuff. So
that's already happening.
Yeah.
I mean, look at, posting a black square for BLM, or that's what all this stuff is. This is all there. That's the loss of the personhood, as we were talking about, the sin, people engaging in sin, they lose their personhood. As they lose their personhood, their identity becomes the hive mind.
Yeah.
It's a replacement. It's an exchange.
That's it. So how, like what Father Seraphim Rose was talking about, how do you think, or if they did, how do these entities that were no, they've always been accessible because people have seen them, but he says it's much worse now, or he's never seen us of that. How did these entities that were usually only accessible through the use of hallucinogenics, how have they been unleashed in the world, and now people are just seeing them randomly?
Technology. Again, I argue that psychedelics are technologies.
Okay.
They're techne. And so it's through these techne, it's through these theurgic activities. And so what's going on we look at Roslin, 1940s, post World War II, embarking on the Cold War. This is propaganda at its finest. This is taking information that the Nazis were working on for space travel, jet propulsion, all this different stuff. Because if you can get the entire world to view everything in a false paradigm, you control everything. Right? All you have to do is, you don't have to have everything has to be a psychological operation. It just has to be the most fundamental beliefs have to be wrong. And if you get somebody to live in a worldview where the most fundamental beliefs are wrong and it points them in the different direction, well, then they're going to reinterpret everything in the world as a corresponding to that false foundational belief. And so getting people to believe in, the 1960s counterculture, psychedelics, transhumanism, Silicon Valley, aliens, to me, it's all part of the same spirit, the same Geist, the same gist, the same movement in history. And that's what as a Christian, that's what this is all about. It's a spiritual war. I agree with Father Seraphim Rose. We're obviously closer to the end times than we've ever been, whatever time that is. And as we approach that more and more people are going to become those Borgs. More and more people are going to lose their personhood, and they're going to become part of the hive mind. And that's going to happen more and more and more and more. And COVID was just the beginning. And so the masks, the vaccines, all this stuff, they're just the beginning point to get people to choose the side of the Borg or the side of somebody who has free will, autonomy, and is made in the image of God.
Yeah. And as you're kind of, because I see this, I'm so troubled. I'm going to let you go. I cut you too long. But, you know, the process is, if you just look at like gender identity and sexual orientation, the generation before me, like the baby boomers, they like came out in the 70s during the sexual revolution. And a lot of these people came out later in life, in their 20s. Some of them had relationships with women. Some had even been married. And in my generation, they grew up on Madonna. We came out a little earlier in our teens, maybe, you know, 18, 19. I came out in 88. I was 18, worst time. It was like the worst of the AIDS epidemic. Now you see children like 12, 13, even prepubescent children coming out as transgender, as gay, non-binary. And the only thing that I can think of that has changed from, let's say, 70s, 80s, 90s to now is technology. And I think a very serious conduit through which, now I'm sounding crazy, not crazy, but I'm sounding like pretentious, but the conduit, that the technological conduit that these entities, hallucinogenic entities that normally you'd only see through psychedelics, have come through the computer and into people's brain is like pornography and social media and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And again, that's the whole point of my academic research, is recategorizing drugs as technology. And but I don't write as an Orthodox Christian, so I'm writing so that somebody who's in favor of a lot of the things we've talked about, when they read my academic work, they'd say, yeah, that's exactly what I believe. That's exactly how I view it. But you're totally right. It's through the technology that this spiritual warfare is really taking place. And so it's the technology is the conduit for the demonic activity to usher and move into the person, because evil has to have a vessel. God created us in his image. And so the whole thing's about taking over our vessel. And so they can only live based on our own energy. And so I think that's exactly what's happening, and why things are accelerating more and more, and why, why was 2020 the year that they chose to make their move? Because we now are in a totally interconnected global economy and information exchange system, that the movement is there's only going to be one culture, nationality, language. I mean, we're moving towards the Tower of Babel, right? It's all about central unified locality, control. That's what's happening. And it's through the technology that I believe the Antichrist will be fully machine and fully man, the full transhumanist project. And I believe it's through the technology that the demons are actually entering into the world and entering into people's souls.
Yeah. I want to end with a couple of quotes. This is probably the most interesting quote I ever read from Timothy Leary. It's so wild. Extraterrestrial intelligence could have sent DNA seed packets out through space to plant life on hospitable planets such as Earth. Okay.
Yeah, it's
the seed packet part is kind of funny. DNA seed packets. It's sort of weird. I don't know. It's very bizarre. But that's I kind of wanted to end with that.
There's a theory called panspermia, right? So panspermia is the idea that there's like that life, planets will blow up and spread DNA to different parts of the universe that will then grow on different planets. That's a theory, at least.
Yeah.
I don't believe in it, but that's a theory that's out there. I don't believe in, me personally, I'm not a supporter of like macro Darwinian Wallace theory of evolution. I don't believe there's a lot of evidence for that.
I just thought that quote kind of brought everything together: counterculture, drugs, aliens, origin of life, everything.
Yeah, it does. So, it's a paradigm. You see, it's literally a paradigm of thought.
And then I wanted to end with kind of a warning. Camille Paglia, she was somebody who had a big influence on me in the 90s. I could hear her speak a few times. I still respect her honesty and her thought. Mm-hmm. She wrote, "I feel that the real revolutionary thinkers of my generation," she talked about the 60s, destroyed their brains on drugs. LSD just leveled all the truly talented people of my generation. So just as a warning to people who are thinking about maybe experimenting with these drugs, I mean, you're walking on a sword.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about clinical studies and under clinical environment, but when you experiment with this stuff recreationally and you think you're going to expand your mind, you could end up destroying your mind. So
It's possible.
better off go to church and
Yeah.
go to a beautiful Russian Orthodox
Yeah. And
liturgy.
just do things the long way. Like if you want to be enlightened, then be a really moral, humble person and you'll get there. I mean, that's the whole Christian journey. I think that everybody just wants a shortcut. And so drugs offer you a glimpse into something that's transcendent for sure. What exactly those things are, I think can be debated. And we've kind of laid out our conclusion and our experiences. But yeah, people need to be careful. I'm always honest. I had a lot of positive experiences. That's why I kept doing them. But I realized that they were leading me in the wrong direction. And once I came into Orthodoxy, or at least learned about it and learned about Logos theology, the last two major psychedelic experiences I've had, which were years ago, basically, they all confronted me that I needed to reorient and follow the Logos. I needed to follow Christ. And then even on the ayahuasca ceremony, the last one I did, it basically, the message was to build the YouTube channel that I have now. And then the ayahuasca stopped working. I'd go to the shaman and get more ayahuasca, and it's just like I was totally sober. And I've never done psychedelics since then. I really don't feel the need. And now it's almost like I'm terrified to experience to open myself up to that based on everything that I've done with Christ and Christianity and all this stuff. Not scared per se, because God will always protect, but I don't see the necessity. I don't see the lure that it had for me for so many years. It's totally gone. There's, maybe the occasional smoking of marijuana would be a temptation, but drugs themselves really aren't. They just aren't what they. It's like I've already ran that program, had those experiences, and now it's like, well, I want something a little bit more. I think I want to get married and have kids and build a business.
That I understand why that I was drawn to those things, because like Father Seraphim talked about, there was a vacuum. There was a very dark black hole within me, and I wanted some way to fill it. And Catholicism, which I was raised with, didn't give me the tools to access, I hate that word access, it sounds technological, but to access God in a meaningful way. So, and my heart goes out to people. I don't look at them as druggies or potheads or, wrecks of people on the streets or transgender or freaks or body modification people. I just think of them as they don't know what to do. They're trying to figure it out. They're trying to seek God. They're looking for God. And, they just get lost along the way. And my heart goes out to them because I understand that place of emptiness that they're coming from. So,
agreed.
I hope that your work and your writings, they become a book of some kind, because just talking with you, I would rather, I like to talk to you, but it would be cool to have it in a book form where I could try to input it, slower.
Yeah. Well, that's my goal, is hopefully in the next year and a half, I'll finish my research. I'll write my dissertation, which will be on the sort of spirituality of technological transcendence. And then I hope to turn that into a book. It's not going to be value laden. So again, it's not going to be coming from the perspective of today, where I'm going to be talking about as an Orthodox Christian or condemning it. I'll be criticizing it as an academic and saying that, look, this is their epistemology, this is their metaphysics, these are where these ideas have historical relationship. And this is how it expresses itself in the 21st century. But I want I want it to be an academic text. I want my first book, my dissertation, to be hopefully, God willing, published by a university press, and that people who are both for it and against it can use my text to just, for research or to describe it. And whether they want to go against it or criticize it, that's what I hope it contributes to academic understandings of, again, this sort of spirituality of technology.
I think the world is hungry for that message, and so I'll pray for that intention, because I think, I think it really I think the time is right.
Yeah.
So hey, God,
I want to speak to a wider audience than just people want to hear the ministry. They can go to the YouTube channel, but I want my academic work to be academic. And so I want people from both sides, different opinions, to be able to use it and appreciate it.
Awesome. Hey, God bless you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.